Good morning, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen. On behalf of the Institute of South Asian Studies, ISAS for short, I warmly welcome you to today's Symposium on India-China relations. To begin the session, it is my pleasure to invite Professor Tan Tai Yong, Director of ISAS, to deliver the opening remarks. Professor Tan.
High Commissioner Dr. Raghavan, Ambassador Tang Yan, Executive Director of ISAS, distinguished guests, ladies and gentlemen, very good morning to all of you, and welcome to this morning's symposium on China-India relations. Now, I remember seeing many of you just yesterday at our first day of the 8th ISAS International Conference, and this is a second installment of this conference. Yesterday we had a very good session, a very good opening by ESM Go, and you would have read his remarks in today's Straits Times. He framed for us a very good parameter for discussion, which was then taken up by various panels throughout the day, discussing bilateral relations, cooperation at global, regional levels, and also challenges of doing businesses in both countries. So now we take the discussion further this morning by inviting a very distinguished lead speaker to share with us his reflections on the longer-term developments of relations between India and China. And I'm very pleased to be able to introduce Indian Ambassador to Beijing, Dr. Jaishankar, who was also formerly Indian High Commission to Singapore. Dr. Jaishankar is a good friend of ISAS. He has given us very good advice. He has supported us in our various enterprises, and we are very happy and honored that he's able to join us in this conference. Now, he will be speaking for about 20-30 minutes, after which we will have a panel of distinguished scholars responding to the points, to his reflections. And each of the scholars will be talking for about 5 minutes in response to his points, after which we will open up the discussion to the whole floor. So without further ado, it's my pleasure now to invite Dr. Jaishankar to present his reflections on China-India relations. Good morning, everybody. It's a great pleasure to be back in Singapore. It's wonderful to see old friends. I'm particularly pleased to see Ambassador Chang Yan, who's been my counterpart for the last 3 years, also here with me today. I chose to speak on a title of India and China 50 years after, because in many ways the relationship is dominated by what happened 50 years ago. Now, even as many in India are immersed in dissecting the 1962 conflict, a few other developments are actually taking place in India-China relations. On Monday, we will have perhaps the largest Chinese economic delegation ever in India, led by the chairman of the National Development and Reform Council. It will be a delegation of almost 200 economic policymakers and implementers. A day later, we would have China's premier conference, the Bao Forum, hold its first ever event in India, where about 150 businessmen and corporate leaders would be meeting their Indian counterparts and discussing business. A few days before, a Chinese entry actually won the Best Film Award at the Calcutta National Film Festival. And in fact, in this month, which is exactly 50 years after the 1962 conflict, we've had an Indian auto company with a British brand doing its groundbreaking ceremony in China.
and a Chinese auto company with an American brand releasing its first passenger car in India. So, as you can see, the relationship actually has its paradoxes. And this is perhaps symbolic in many ways of the state of relations 50 years after. Now, for a general observer, this relationship is more than a little confusing, because its orthodox understanding is of a rivalry. It is dominated by the border dispute, and it appears to be driven by political competition. But that perception struggles to explain the burgeoning trade between the two nations, or they're making common cause on issues like climate change. The fact is that there are two narratives of India-China relations that coexist. One is centered around the 1962 conflict. The other reflects the more contemporary goals and the compulsions of globalization. Both are equally real, even if believers of one tend to underplay the other. And reconciling them is actually the challenge that we grapple with daily in policymaking. Now, as many of you know, the 1962 conflict left many unresolved issues. Among them is a boundary dispute that is the subject of prolonged negotiations. Recent years have also seen debates over sovereignty and jurisdiction. China has sought to influence the balance of power within the Indian subcontinent, and this has consequences that continue to this day. There are deeper legacy issues as well, reflected in the levels of trust and the limits of contacts. That makes it much harder to appreciate each other's interests and aspirations. 50 years later, we still struggle with a difficult inheritance and should perhaps reflect on its lessons. Now, a decade or more of attempting normalization, the 80s, the 70s and the 80s, it was really left to Rajiv Gandhi in 1988 to take decisive steps that laid the basis for what is the more positive narrative of the relationship. The impasse that served the interests of neither nation has since given way steadily to sustained political engagement, to growing economic activity, and to an active convergence on global issues. Nurtured assiduously by successive governments, it is reflected in frequent leadership meetings, new mechanisms of cooperation, and more agreements. Let me give you a few examples of the change. Prime Minister Manmohan Singh has probably met his Chinese counterparts more times than all his predecessors combined. Of the 130 odd agreements between India and China, 60% of them actually date to the last decade alone. And we have today 36 dialogues and mechanisms, and again the bulk of them go back to this period. Now there's no question that the game changer in the relationship has been its economic aspects. Bilateral trade, which was less than $3 billion in 2000, was last year $74 billion. India is also the largest destination for Chinese project exports, which are estimated at US dollars 55 billion today, mainly in the infrastructure sector. 19 Chinese state-owned enterprises have established more than 40 offices in India. And investment figures are, of course, a little harder to estimate because of the routing. But clearly they're growing, and they're growing rapidly. Among the prominent Chinese companies already in India are Lenovo, Sony, Haier, Huawei, ZTE, Yugong, TBA, Zoomlion. In China, the Indian footprint includes the Tatas, Mahindras, Infosys, Wipro, NIIT, is sitting here, Bharat Forge, Thermax, Sundaram Fasteners, Dr. Reddy's, Binani Cement. I could keep going. Now that the economic engagement has reached serious levels can be gauged from market shares. It is estimated that 30 to 35% of the power plants which are under construction in India under the 12th five-year plan period are sourced from China. Chinese telecom companies are also estimated to have about 35% of the wireless infrastructure market in India. Lenovo leads the Indian PC market with a 9% share. Sony leads the Indian construction equipment market with a 20% share. And TBEA leads the Indian high voltage transmission market with a 27% share. In China, the Indian presence is a little more modest, but is beginning to make its mark. Mahindras have 9% of the tractor market, second only to John Deere as a foreign player. Binani Cements manage a sizable quarry to cement operation. NIIT operates 205 centers for its IT education business. The Tatas, of course, are across the spectrum, and I mentioned the JLR Cherry plant opening last week. These developments have two drivers. One is the frugal Indian economy that welcomes competitive outputs, including from China. That displays a degree of pragmatism which is actually reminiscent of China itself during its economic growth. In many sectors, the availability of the Chinese option has compelled vendors of other nations to be more reasonable. The growth of India-China trade is a natural reflection of India's quest for economic competitiveness. The other is the globalization of Indian companies and the relevance of China to their larger ambitions, which is both a market and a base for third country exports. Another area of convergence worth noting is in global issues. As developing economies, India and China are both sensitive to food and energy security. They work closely on the Doha Development Round. Their economies feel the impact of high commodity prices as much as they do of market protectionism. Their cooperation on climate change is impelled by the need to protect their growth prospects. They are also two nations which have very strong sovereignty concerns. As a result, they work far more closely than most observers perceive in multilateral forums, including the United Nations. As rising powers, India and China naturally nurse hopes of playing a greater role in global deliberations. The international financial crisis has opened up possibilities, and we see them cooperating in G20 meetings as well as in forums like the BRICS, of which the two of them are key members. In some ways, all of this is a throwback to the pre-62 era, except that this time around, it is driven more by interest than by sentiment. The duality of conflicting narratives is more complicated than you would tend to imagine. Contradictions apart, new issues sometimes inject fresh life into dormant distrust. Even progress can actually create its own difficulties. Let me explain. Controversies over visas revived arguments over sovereignty and territoriality. Defense exchanges were actually briefly affected by a desire for selective engagement. Trans-border rivers are a subject of great sensitivity. Even if creative diplomacy prevails, which it has in these cases, it does remind us that the embers of the past remain alive. Accommodating each other's rights has not been an easy process. Although both nations seek to expand the nuclear share of their energy mix, India's global engagement in that regard does not seem to get adequate understanding. Nor has the Indian goal of occupying a permanent seat in the UN Security Council struck a chord, although there is ample history of Indian support for China's cause. Conversely, China's growing presence and activities beyond its borders raises questions among sections of Indian opinion. There is, of course, no getting away from the border dispute that is so central to the first narrative. Special representatives who have been charged with finding solutions have held 15 rounds of talks so far. We have reached an agreement on the political parameters and the guiding principles of a settlement. However, it is difficult to disclose details of what is work in progress. Since that constrains us from generating news, the focus shifts to transgressions across the line of control, real or perceived. In all of this, the achievement of maintaining peace and tranquility through 4 agreements in 1996, 2005 and 2012 may not always be adequately appreciated. Respect for that achievement should rise when we see other disputes where that has not been possible. This is also perhaps an appropriate juncture to draw attention to our expanding defense exchanges. Discussions during the recent visit to India of Defense Minister Liang Guangli have added to that intensity. The engagement process is all the more important as modernization efforts are underway in both militaries. The area perhaps where we have the most catching up to do is in people-to-people contacts. The number of Indian students in China has grown appreciably. We now estimate it at around 10,000. In contrast, Chinese students in India are still less than 1,000. Cultural activities on the whole remain limited, although we have had some exceptional events in 2010 and 2011. Few of our films are shown in each other's countries. In China's case, more due to quota restrictions than lack of public interest in Bollywood. Contacts between our media have grown in recent years, assisted by strong support from the governments, and think tank exchanges have flourished, although they too have room to grow. Now last year, about 700,000 people traveled between the 2 countries. It's a great improvement of the past, but compare this with figures for Japan and China, which is 4.64 million, and Japan and Korea, which was 6.5 million. Air connectivity is limited, which is actually as much a cause as a symptom of the problem. But the real distance, I would argue, is an intellectual one. The history of India-China cultural interactions find little recognition among our intelligentsia. Modern history writing has also been very parsimonious in acknowledging our debt to each other. And our shared heritage has fallen victim to politics. Narrowing this distance is essential if we are to develop more empathy between our 2 societies. It was that realization which actually prompted the Nalanda University initiative. And in the same spirit, we are today preparing jointly an encyclopedia and on India-China cultural contacts, an idea incidentally of George Yeo. We are publishing too a Chinese translation of Professor P.C. Bagchi's masterful work on the cultural impact of India and China on each other over 1,000 years. A more long-term effort is to start teaching Chinese Mandarin as a foreign language in Indian middle and high schools. And we have just signed an agreement with Hanban recently in that regard. If there is a silver lining in the cultural cloud, it is in an awareness of what we are missing. Overall, the economic story has been an encouraging one, but it too has created its own issues. Prominent among them is a growing trade deficit, estimated last year at $27 billion. Trade is rarely a subject of unanimity, and that with China is perhaps more divisive than others. Some sectors in Indian industry have clearly benefited from Chinese technology, equipment, components and ingredients. Others have not, many of them small and medium enterprises. The bottom line is that the Indian economy has been extraordinarily open to Chinese goods, and the numbers speak for themselves. The picture is somewhat different for Indian companies vis-à-vis China. Our trade basket is dominated by ores, cotton, yarn and some chemicals. Indian industry is not uncompetitive otherwise. Our problem is we face market access challenges. The Chinese duty structure is very hard on value-added engineering products that are India's forte. Registration processes are a major deterrent to pharmaceutical exports. Local production requirements keep out an auto ancillary industry, which actually has otherwise very impressive Deming certifications. Government contracts do not favor foreign companies. SPS, sanitary phytosanitary negotiations, have been painful, and only 3 of 17 agro items have been cleared over 11 years of negotiations. Quotas and restraints hamper our entertainment industry. Trade and services are often conditional on investment. And the bottom line is that trading without a local presence actually has serious limitations. These issues have created a situation that is not in the interest of either party, and it remains to be seen if our joint search for solutions is serious and effective. Greater investments can offer some solutions while also raising the economic engagement to a higher level. The nature of the market in both countries will push investors to localize. This should end up creating relationships that play back into the home economies. Investments can also help support and sustain more smoothly projects in India based on China sourcing. Better technologies, additional capacities, and overall efficiency are, of course, the obvious benefits of more investment. Challenges faced in investment are very different in India and China. They bear examination because today many companies are poised to make decisions. Weak demand in developed markets could push them in the right direction faster than we might expect. It is important that Chinese investments feel welcome in India. Perhaps they don't entirely right now. That the relationship still carries some political baggage makes many companies more than a little hesitant. We are trying to address that concern through policy pronouncements and government signals. Next week, at the Strategic Economic Dialogue that's due to take place in Delhi, we hope to be able to highlight a number of sectors for future cooperation. Publicizing progress on the ground is equally important. A promotional film that we have brought out on investment that capture the experiences of current Chinese companies in India has actually had a very good impact. We have it here. I was hoping at one stage to show it. Success stories are also being written about, and hopefully we will get a few more books on that subject. As part of the strategy, the information gap is being addressed through an investor guide that we have specifically written up in Mandarin for Chinese investors, potential investors looking at India. It must also be recognized that Chinese companies have a limited understanding of the Indian market. India may be China's 7th largest export destination, but most of that business was delivered by Indian sourcing in China, not by Chinese marketing in India. The knowledge curve, therefore, lags considerably behind the numbers. Based on what happens in their own country, Chinese companies often expect assistance from Indian local governments. Similarly, they hope for positive discrimination and China-specific carve-outs. Chinese corporate planning finds problematic to adjust to the smaller scale that is more appropriate for the Indian situation. Assessments of skills availability and management of labor are more difficult than we might think. For certain categories of products, branding is also an issue. In the field of projects, Chinese companies have struggled to create a working model that is less reliant on the export of their own labor. Matching business cultures can be as challenging as operating under different rules and regulations. Prospects for Indian companies in China are no more certain, although their problems are very different. The IT industry and services in general should note the Chinese interest in expanding the services segment of their economy. But they have to localize much more to overcome their current HR limitations. Areas like pharmaceuticals are promising as China's health sector upgrades, but a more detailed understanding of the working of the Chinese market is required. Pressures to invest will remain strong, as will be the attraction of obtaining national treatment in China. But finding a reliable and long-term local partner is itself an entry challenge. Given the mismatch of scales, even successful JVs feel the push for continuous expansion. Indian industry also needs to appreciate the rapid pace of changes in China. With higher labor costs and better skills, China is moving up the technology ladder very rapidly and displaying much more sensitivity to environmental costs. That China will provide a different set of opportunities for those willing to make commitments now. The India-China Economic Connect is being facilitated by the creation of a more positive enabling environment. There has been some progress in the establishment of banking facilities, though Chinese licensing practices pose viability issues for Indian banks. The first Chinese bank branch opened last year in Mumbai, and we await further development. As part of a BRICS understanding, it was also agreed that Indian companies in the infrastructure sector would be permitted RMB-denominated ECBs, subject to caps. The banking industry in China is expanding its familiarity with corporate India, and we have seen the beginnings of project financing. China's neighbors are among its top trade partners. In contrast, India's are not. That is partly because South Asia is both underdeveloped and under-integrated. The emergence of China as a significant neighboring trade partner is a new experience for India. China has experience in dealing with neighboring economies. India's is relatively limited. Economic dependence with political differences, which is really the challenge of reconciling the two narratives, has its legitimate worries. We should also note that China is a net importer vis-à-vis most of its neighbors. Machinery from Japan, ROK and Taiwan, components and raw materials from the ASEAN, energy and raw materials from Russia and Central Asia. The relationship with India is relatively unique because it's more export-driven, and that calls for greater understanding of a very different work culture. Now, how can Singapore come into this equation? To a degree, it already has, through ASEAN-led forums and its CICA with India. Much of what is taken for granted in Singapore is actually rocket science for Chinese companies working on their India strategy. They grapple with issues like location and infrastructure. They do not understand that demand in India can be regionally differentiated, nor have they developed adequate comfort with the process challenges that India can sometimes offer. As Chinese interest in investing in India grows, there are natural opportunities for more experienced players who've been there and done that. India and China have to come to terms with the past if they have to contemplate a better future. They cannot airbrush the difficult times of their history, but nor must they live in it. There are complementaries and convergences waiting to be exploited, just as there is a trust deficit waiting to be addressed. At the 18th Communist Party of China Congress, President Hu Jintao called on countries to accommodate the legitimate concerns of others when pursuing their own interests. Such a far-sighted approach would surely help shift the balance in favor of a more positive narrative. Thank you very much.
I'm going to now ask my fellow panelists to respond to Ambassador Jaishankar's paper. And I would request that they stay very focused and speak for no more than 5 minutes so that we'll have sufficient time for an engagement with the audience later on. We are starting in no order of preference, but just, I guess, the way they spoke yesterday. So I'm going to start from my extreme right, and I'm going to ask my colleague, Professor Sona Raja, from the Faculty of Law, to perhaps share with us his responses. Prof, please.
Thank you, Tai Yong. The Ambassador has given a very comprehensive expose of India-China relations. And he has quite rightly focused upon, can you hear me? Yeah.
No, they can't hear you in fact.
Yeah. He has quite rightly focused upon the economic relationship between these two countries, which are no doubt flourishing. As I spoke yesterday, we can divide the people who view this problem from the point of view of romantic scholars who want to ensure that the relationship between the two countries prospers, and of course the realist viewpoint which wants to highlight the fact that there is quite a lot that is wrong between China and India. Being a person with a romantic vision, I would always highlight the fact that there is a growing tendency to view positively the relationship that is between China and India. And I have looked at this problem largely from the point of view of an international lawyer. On the focus on economic matters, I would not say much because there are many economists on the panel, and my Chinese colleague Wang Jiangyu and I have written a book on China, India, and international economic law, which was published last year. I want to focus largely upon the global issues, which are not adequately commented upon in the literature. When you look at the global issues, and the ambassador quite rightly adverted to the cooperation that exists between these two countries when confronting global issues, one finds that there is a great deal of conformity. The conformity is reflected in the common attitudes that the two countries have taken in relation to current problems that are going on. For example, when it comes to Libya, when it comes to Syria, when it comes to Palestine, there is a unity of approach that has been taken by the two countries. Evidence of that could be found in the Delhi Declaration of the BRICS countries, which was issued just this year. So on Palestine, for example, the declaration requires that there should be a solution in accordance with international law, giving recognition to the fact that Palestinian statehood must be eventually achieved. On Libya, the statement takes the strong stance that what took place was wrong because there was no sanction given to a regime change being effected in that country. Likewise, in the case of Syria, both China and India agree that there must be a solution that is found by the parties within Syria with the assistance of the whole of the United Nations. So what is important to focus upon is not only the economic interaction between these two countries, which is becoming stronger, but the fact that externally, on global issues, there is coming to be a united front that is being shown, so that there would be eventually development of an India-China attitude towards international law and the international problems of the world. We find, for example, that the two countries are strong supporters of an international law on development, ensuring that there is development not only of China and India, but of the whole of the third world. So it is wrong to say that now that these two countries are developing, they have ditched their aspirations for being the champions of the developing world. No doubt there are problems between the two countries, and the realist vision that there are issues to be settled must be faced. I do not soft pedal the fact that the embers of the past, as the ambassador would put it, are still smoldering. But in my view, it is best to pour as much cold water on these embers so that they would cease to burn. One of course has concerns with issues of the boundary problems, the border rivers, energy concerns, the fact that China is increasingly active in countries like Sri Lanka, Nepal, and other South Asian countries which are the traditional areas of Indian influence, the entry into the Indian Ocean. These would be political problems, no doubt. And it is wrong on my part to say that one should not focus upon these problems. But it is possible to emphasize the fact that in the interest of the world at large, a multipolar order should emerge, rather than have an order that is a hegemonic order that is dominated by a single state. And the evolution of this multipolar order which would ensure that there is a plural ideology that shapes the course of the world is essential, not only for China and India, but for the rest of the world as well. I think my time is up, so I shall stop.
Thank you, Sona, for introducing the global perspective and the role that India and China will play in evolving a fully multipolar world order. Now I'd like to invite Dr. Biswajit Kar, who is the Director General Research and Information System for Developing Countries based in Delhi, India. Biswajit, please.
Thank you, Tai Yong. One of the clear messages that we got from Ambassador's statement was the fact that India-China relation is fraught with contradictions at every level. If you look at mentioned about the political level and any movement on the India-China border doesn't stop making headlines in the national press, and of course there is a very strong reaction. At the same time, what he also told us that over the last 10 years, the number of agreements that the two countries have done has been really unprecedented, and that really shows the way these two countries are inclined politically. But I'll look at more of the economic and the messages that are coming through. The first reality that one must look at is that today China is India's largest trading partner with almost 10% share, and this has actually grown. It just happened in the last 2 years. The two countries have a trade target of reaching $100 billion in 2015, and already we have reached almost $76 billion in 11-12. So quite on course. In fact, we might actually exceed the target that has been set. But while this is happening, while we have seen this kind of trade increase, leaps and bounds over the past few years, in fact, in the last 4 years, we've seen a doubling of trade. At another level, at the level of the business people, again one sees this contradiction. If one talks to or one looks at the messages coming from the big industry, there is an element of extreme, I would say, resentment to the involvement of the Chinese in Indian economy. So one would hear things like representations being made by the industry to raise tariffs on whatever products the Chinese are interested in. Ambassador mentioned about electrical products, but at the same time, electrical equipment, Chinese are exporting quite a lot. But the electrical manufacturers are always making representation to the government to increase tariffs. India uses anti-dumping actions. Is in fact was one of the largest users of anti-dumping actions past few years, and the biggest target was in fact the Chinese. So again, as you all know, that anti-dumping actions are actually triggered by complaints made by the industry, specific industries. So at the level of these industry associations, again there is a conflicting narrative. While there is a section which doesn't want Chinese to export to India, but the ground reality is that the Chinese exports are motoring along, coming into India. I would say the real concern is the rising trade imbalance. And if I look at last year's figure, just did some back of the envelope calculations, the trade balance as a percentage of exports, I'm looking at Indian numbers, it was minus 218%. So it's a huge, and many of us are quite convinced that this kind of imbalance is really unsustainable. You really can't have sane economic relations taking place between two large economies with this kind of a trade imbalance. Now, what is the way forward? Clearly, the way forward is what Ambassador was mentioning, and this is what we call investment-led trade. Now, there is a change in the attitude of the the government of India towards foreign investment. We have actually been trying to modify our policies, making it more attractive for foreign investors. And I'm sure along with this will also happen a change in the sentiments towards the Chinese investors. And if this can happen, that the Chinese investors, the Chinese companies decide to relocate in India, China is becoming a more expensive destination. The wage costs are going up. One can see the resolution of this kind of large trade imbalance over a period of time. At least one can look forward to some movement towards resolving this problem. So I think here the key is how we address the issue of Chinese investment in India. Again, it's a question of mindset. But I'm sure the kind of positives that loom in the horizon and the kind of I would say benefits that India stands to have from Chinese investments and a whole range of technologies, particularly in the frontier areas, and the solar and computing technologies and the hardware. That I think it's entirely possible that this kind of problem that we are facing on the trade issues will be resolved, and this is going to lead to a more sustained relationship between the two countries. Thank you.
Thank you, Dr.
Underscoring the positives of the economic relations, but also the imperatives of having to deal with the trade imbalance. Now we'll hear perhaps the Chinese view, and I'm delighted to invite the Provost from the Shanghai Institute of Foreign Trade to share with us.
Thank you, Professor Han. I appreciate Ambassador Jaishankar's presentation and remarks on China-Indian relations. Literally 50 years after, we have the perspective of the next 50 years. As you mentioned, next Monday we have the Chinese economic delegation to go to New Delhi, have a dialogue. I think it's economic dialogue. It's a bilateral dialogue. It's Professor Dr. Dar mentioned also it's bilateral. We have many bilateral trade and economic problems we have to talk, like the trade deficit. But I would like to talk about the regional, not only bilateral but also multilateral. As you mentioned in your remarks, compared to Chinese economic connections with Chinese neighbors, particularly with Japan, with South Korea, with ASEAN countries, as you mentioned, we have very close economic relationship with these countries. But in South Asia, you can see, as you mentioned, India has very small trades or economic connections. So, even compare to Chinese integration with ASEAN, with Japan, with others. The India has very small, smaller connection with its neighbors, like even Bangladesh or Bangladesh, that countries. I'm wondering why. Why did it happen? The one I would have mentioned that there may be something more, as you mentioned that two narratives. Maybe we have one more narrative. In the last 50 years, if we go back to the 50 years ago, we can see after the war we have the misperceptions. I think from my point of view, is strategic intention. In the 1960s, in the Cold War era, Chinese government is worrying about the Indian, maybe have a line with the Soviet Union in that time. And later, after the disappearance of the Soviet Union, later in the US India, as a superpower, China is worrying about the India can be used by the United States to contain China. This kind of a global balance power, China is worrying about. The Indian can be used in that power game. On the other hand, you can see that India is worried about China. At the same time, that China is bigger. China is, particularly after the 1980s, China is economic development, and China has stronger economic power later. And India is worried about that China maybe doing, as you mentioned, the Chinese pursue, as you word, pursue all balance of power in Asia, in Indian subcontinent. So you are worrying about that also kind of sort of, the balance power regionally. China is worried about its environment, security environment globally. So this misperception, I think, we have to understand each other. Actually, for the last 50 years, this is wrong. Actually, this is harmful for both of us. That's why I mentioned even yesterday. I think we should do more to build this kind of bilateral strategy, trust. This will be very helpful. We have so much, strategic misunderstanding of intentions in us, between us. So I'm thinking that how to service this problem. I think, I agree with you totally. So one is people to people. I know when I was in India, I talked with the college students, also the young students, middle school students on the way, is that I remember it's very interesting. It's a very small boy. Is that I think it's middle school. Is that the Chinese product is very cheap. Yeah. This is one I know. The second is Chinese boys have many girlfriends. That doesn't mean China is a very open country. That's what he understands China. That's just young students, so middle school students. So it's surprised me also. That's why the people-to-people connections, people-to-people exchange is very, very important. I talked with the Chinese President, Ambassador Zhang, as I think also people-to-people exchanges, particularly in the young generation. That's why I'm doing more in this field, to help to build more university-to-university exchanges. Second, I want to mention that maybe another we can do is economically. We have bilateral economic trade deficit issues. We have other, the markets access programs. Yes, we are agree. All of us, I think we accept this. Accepts is clear. Can we find other way to solve this problem? For example, China can be more engaged in the regional economic regional economic integration in South Asia, and India can even more in Asia, in Southeast Asia, in East Asia, ASEAN. I think we can do more. Yeah, one more. That's a strategic dialogue. The third one is we should have more strategic dialogue, not only on economic field, but also as a security field.
Thank you, Professor Wong. I think the point here going to the Prof is that perhaps China's intentions are misunderstood. There isn't a clarity of what China hopes to do, and India is suspicious of China's intentions in the region. And this solution is perhaps better, more people-to-people relationship and strategic dialogues could resolve some of these mutual suspicions. Thank you, Prof. Now I'd like to invite Professor William Lin from the University of Western Australia to share his views.
Thank you very much, Professor Tan. Just very quickly on the people-to-people relationship. I have been reading some internet blogs written by Chinese backpackers traveling across the entire India internet. Very interesting story, fascinating story, because these guys, they spend 100 rupees a day. They get really very, very close to the local cultural, local people. Very interesting story. Now, it's a very difficult task to comment on the investor's speech because he has been so comprehensive, so spot on. So, given the time constraint, I only probably highlight 3 points or comments on his speech. The first point on the economic relationship, second one on the general relationship between the two countries, last point on the place of the two countries in the world. Very briefly, the ambassador mentioned the economic relationship as it grows up between the two countries, but my comment is that it's still not efficient. The level of engagement between the two countries doesn't match the size of the two economies. Those two economies are largest economies in the world. So what really happened in the 1962 is really unfortunate. The two countries haven't really get over with that. My limited historical knowledge, Buddhism was introduced to China and prospered in China as well. And even in more recent history, during the Second World War II, the Chinese army was trained in India and launched offensive battles from India all the way to Chinese to the mainland. So the two countries have been very peaceful, with one exception, that's 1963. Now, on the trade issues, at the moment, there's huge deficit favoring China. What I want to say, we don't have to worry about this. Over time, it will disappear, or probably one day, the deficit will be in India's favor. Why is that? As the ambassador mentioned, that China is now climbing the value chain, it's upgrading its industry. Its growth model will change from supply-oriented to demand-oriented. So let's think about 10 or 20 years' time. When Chinese growth is mainly driven by domestic demand, who can supply a country like the size of China? I think the only country which can supply is India. So one day, we won't be surprised that everything consumed in China will come from India. At the moment, India buys a lot from China. So we should be, I'm very optimistic about this. The second point on the general relationship, sometimes as a scholar, we're a bit shy to talk about the competition between two countries. As an economist, that's in the background, I think competition is a good thing because it exists everywhere. So siblings compete in a family, countries compete, it's natural. It's good for economic development, for the general wealth of the nation. Then, on the other issue, on the other side, the two countries can cooperate in many areas. As the ambassador pointed out rightly, these are two largest developing economies. Naturally, they share a lot in common. So, for example, in terms of climate change policies and in many other areas. So, the general relationship, competition, and the collaboration, and eventually prosperity of the two countries. The last point, I'll try to be a little speculative about the place of China, India, in Asia, and in the world in general. Definitely, China, India will be the largest economy in this region. Why is that? One prediction is that at the moment, Japanese economy is still stronger than Indian economy. The prediction is that in 50 years' time, the Japanese population will shrink by a half. So from currently near say 100 million to just about 50 million. So basically, the country, unless the Japanese will do something serious in the changes such as immigration policy, Japan will become a middle-sized country, not a big country, not a big economy anymore. So in the future, definitely will be China and India in Asia. In the world, I don't want to be too pessimistic about the U.S. economy. That if you look at history, say 1,000, 2,000 years, we have big nations, powerful nations, powerful economies. Their destination is the same. They're going to decline. I think the same will happen to the U.S. economy in say 40, 50 years time. In the future, at least in the immediate future, 50, even in the current century, will be India and China. So I'm very optimistic about this. Thank you.
Thank you. So now a very optimistic picture of China and India dominating the world economies, and the point also being made that despite the size, the volume of trade is not optimal as I see it. We can do much better. So finally, I'm going to ask, last but not least, Mr. Prakash Menon, President of NIIT China in Shanghai, to share with you. Prakash, please.
You will notice, like yesterday, I am one of the last speakers. I still continue to feel like Liz Taylor's fourth husband. I know what to do, but I don't know how to make a difference. So we've been doing some successful work in China, and I'll try and articulate this through an example of what I think is important. So we were trying to do this massive deal with one of the city governments in China. We were interested because we knew we could deliver. The government was interested because we had proven that we could deliver. So I had my senior colleagues from India. I don't get into the negotiation table. I stay away from it for obvious reasons. Everything went well. Dinner was supposed to happen after that, and the mayor was supposed to attend the dinner. But there was one point which they raised at the last minute, which is they wanted us to shift our headquarters from Shanghai to the city. And my Indian colleague said, that's not possible. Because we have a huge contingent sitting there, families there, school-going children, you can't shift them to another city. And therefore, this was a showstopper. So both teams went back, and the government negotiator from the city side said, look, I can't help this. This is where I can't help you. This is the mayor's request. Well, we did go for dinner, and they came back very dejected. I heard the story, and I had the answer. So the Chinese side said, shift your headquarters. No deal. The India side said, that's not possible. So I gave a solution. I said, we'll have dual headquarters. We will have two. Problem got solved, deal was signed. And I remember an Indian colleague of mine looking at me, would come from Delhi saying, Prakash, you've become Chinese. It's all about engagement. We took the top 21 students from NIT from all over China, for a 21-day holiday come studies in India. I'm cutting the story short, but we put one NIT student from India with every one student from China. The Indian student did not know Chinese. The Chinese student did not know English. Well, at the penultimate day, the 20th day, we did have a dinner at the ambassador's residence, the Chinese ambassador. The Indian students sang Chinese songs, and the Chinese students did 3 Bollywood dances. And the then ambassador told me, Prakash, can you bring 1 million students into India? This engagement, from a time in 1997 when I went into China, and when my board told me, go to Shanghai, I actually had to open the map to find out where is Shanghai. From then to today, 15 years, it's been engagement, 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 understanding China, understanding the culture, understanding its people. The food, by the way, is lovely, so that's easy to understand. It's been only that. So to me, personally, from a time of distrust to trust, from a time when I was closed about many things, because I came from what I knew, I had to defreeze from that and freeze into something else. It's not about what is right and what is wrong, it's about what it is. It's been a wonderful journey. And I truly believe that the initiatives that Ambassador Jaishankar is on with in China today, and I think he's doing a lot of work in China, and he's doing more work back home in India. I think the story of East meeting the East will be the true story for the century. Thank you.